So it certainly can't be said that we don't live in interesting times when it comes to playing role playing games. With the recent upheaval and everything that has happened with Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, there are still a lot of people out there looking to move away from playing with the giant gorilla in the room. Maybe they're looking for their next big elephant that they can play with. Who knows? But there certainly is no lack of games to play. All you have to do is go on to Drive Through RPG and start scrolling. Thank God they don't have infinite scroll. But that makes for interesting choices. So, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Are you just going to look for a system that is like the one you're playing? Because right now, a lot of people are looking to vacate away from D20 and try something else. Or maybe they're looking at trying to stick with D20 because familiarity is easy. I mean, let's face it. For a game system that's been around for what, 40 some odd years, the game has gone through a lot of evolution. Some people liked it, some didn't. Some people split and went different ways, but they kept the same system. So, what are you going to do? Are you going to stick with D20 or are you going to try something else? So let's take a look at a bunch of games. I'm a game hopper. I play a lot of different games. Maybe you're interested in trying to get a group together that's also wanting to do that, or you're looking for your group, or your group has decided that you want to try something else. Maybe it's a system that is completely different from what you've been playing. The challenge there is that there's always some learning involved. There's always some baggage that's brought over from the previous game you played because let's face it, you're familiar with playing that game. There are things about that game system that you like and that you can hopefully find in other systems. Well, you're going to have to stick within a certain range of that family to get what's familiar. Familiar, yet different, right? Like chocolate with fudge. So, what do you got? Okay, in the realm of things that are the same but different, let's go back in time and then let's kind of move forward, right? The OSR or whatever they want to call it. For me, this is my old school essentials book. I do not own an original hardcover copy. The reason I don't own an original copy for this particular game is that, I mean, look at what's happened. The game has been hacked over the years. When you look at the change in development that D20 has gone through, Dungeons and Dragons, if that's what we want to classically say, it's been nothing but the new designers coming in, taking over the game, and then adding their own rules, changing how some rules work, and then moving on. We saw this from the old chainmail moving into homes and all that stuff, and Beck Me, and then moving into advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and then some huge changes in third edition Dungeons and Dragons. Some massively upheaving changes in Dungeons and Dragons with fourth edition that actually caused one of the original splits. Then we go back to fifth edition with what we see now, where we have another fork in the road. The big reason why I printed my PDF, and I printed my PDF at scale for the digest size books and then put them in this binder, was because it's my collection of the way this old school essentials is organized is great. It's clean, it's clear. It has all the basics I need to add all of my past notes, all of my past house rules, everything that I wanted to play as D&D. I don't play 5th edition. My edition is probably 3rd, to me anyway. I've played the real 3rd edition, liked it, didn't like it. Played Pathfinder, liked it, didn't like it. But that's all opinion. That's all personal preference. So what do you got other than this, right? Still want to play fantasy? Okay. Let's try something simpler and easy to get into, but very different. Okay, there's one thing we know a lot of people really wanted out of this latest debacle with D&D. WotC, Hasbro, whatever you want to call it. It's that we wanted to support creative people. We wanted to support people who went in different directions, who saw things in a different way, kept it simple, and made it easy to do. Okay, so for that, we got these two. Easy D6, ICRPG, Index Card RPG. By now, if you haven't seen these two creators on YouTube, and I'll put links for their channels in the thingamajig down below, you really should go and check out their channels. They're great people. They've been in the community for a long time. I think they're very upstanding pillars of the community. They've definitely put a lot of creative energy into the work that they've designed. And overall, these games are great to play. They're easy to pick up. There's a lot that's familiar. There's a lot of stuff that's not. But they're not complicated. These aren't 400-page books. I mean, yeah, sure. Index Card RPG and even Easy D6, by comparison, one is a little bit thicker than the other. This is being the thick guy here. Thank you, Runehammer. But that's also because this little booklet has a couple of different settings in it that you can play too. It's not just purely fantasy, but it takes some concepts and applies them to, let's say, science fiction and a few other things, and it'd be pretty easy to adapt. But what if you want something that kind of is familiar? What if you want something that's been around for a while, has a lot, if not just as much or more, well, that could be debatable, lore developed for it? Where do you go then? Okay, so for me, there was a game that when we had played AD&D and we wanted to expand into other game systems, there was really, and we wanted to stay with fantasy. And for me, there was really only one game on the market at the time that really had the largest appeal for me. I, at that time, was developing a huge favoritism for the grim darkness of Warhammer. Pardon me. This is a Warhammer fantasy role-playing, and it's the latest edition by Cubicle 7. It's a great rule set. If you're even remotely familiar with Warhammer fantasy, it would be an easy game to step into. It still has a lot of the familiar game mechanics that we've seen over the ages. This game into itself has gone through a few iterations, and like D&D, there's a black sheep in the family, although it did lead to my favoring a different type of game as well. So for its evolution, Warhammer Fantasy has still really stuck true to its bones. And that is in a large part due to Games Workshop. If you think Hasbro and WotC could be controlling, you haven't seen nothing yet. So that aside, if you want to stick with fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay would definitely be a game for you. But let's say you really want to step out of your comfort zone and try something that is not like these games, something that is very different. Now, where do you go to get something like that? 2 games, 1 developer. So, Forbidden Lands, Sumburum. These games, this has kind of been called a little bit reliant on some of the classic ideas, although it is a very different system, both mechanically and setting-wise. Same thing here. 2 different approaches from one company that's done a fantastic job of game development and trying to branch out in several different directions, covering science fiction, covering fantasy, covering mystery in a sense with Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood. It's a game that delved into intellectual property, which is something that a lot of developers have a tendency to stay away from. And it's definitely something that you should look at. both of these games, Forbidden Lands and Symbaroum, have aspects of them to where it makes them easy to learn with uh, the player facing mechanics contained in Symbaroum, and a very simple D6 dice pool system that does a lot of talking back to the players, meaning that you don't just make a roll and do something, but you make a roll and you get additional information, and the dice have a lot of influence over what is going on. But what if you're done with fantasy? What if you really just want to hop ship and try something completely different? Maybe you want to investigate a game that a lot of people have talked about for a very long time and is kind of in your wheelhouse, maybe. So Chaosium has been around for a long time, and you may be wondering why I didn't use Mithras or RuneQuest as a game that I would put in with the fantasy context. And that mostly has to do with the fact that while I have played the game, I do not actually own a physical copy of the rules. I have them on PDF, and I've played RuneQuest and Mithras, uh, not extensively, but I've played them enough to understand their concepts, and I could recommend them as solid games to play. They will appeal, those two particular games appeal to a particular kind of approach to game. They're a little bit more crunchy. Meaning that they have a little bit more details in their rules. And while they may seem very combat focused with the extensive amount of combat, its approach to combat is not as abstract as most of these other game systems are. It is very much a system that loves to talk about the blow by blow. But we're getting away from fantasy. We're going to Cosmic Horror. This is a game developed by Chaosium that is, at this point, kind of legendary. Not just in part to the subject matter that it addresses and the history of cosmic horror with H.P. Lovecraft, but that the game is well loved and well appreciated. It's extremely well developed. This is the new 7th edition, and personally, I love a lot of the things that have been put into its development as a system, uh, being born from what could be called basic role playing, uh, a generic system used by Chaosium, seen exclusively in games like Mithras and RuneQuest, original Call of Cthulhu, and also known lovingly as the Big Gold Book, the BGB. Uh, if you're looking for a game where you want to try and get into a bit more genre specific, meaning you want something that takes place during a particular era or time frame outside of fantasy or outside of science fiction, maybe you are looking to explore the aspects of what does it mean to run a really good mystery game, an investigation that takes place. Now, this game also kind of appeals to a certain group of people. This is not a game where combat is half of it. It's not really even a quarter of it. In fact, it's kind of discouraged. The joke is, the character who survives is the one who can run the fastest or trip up everybody else in the party as they're being chased by the cosmic horrors. Definitely a game worth investigating and expanding your range of thinking into and your range of experiences into. But what if we want to jump to a system which is different? Maybe we want to try something that is unlike percentage dice. It's unlike a D6 dice pool. It's unlike rolling a single die for resolving what's going on in the game. Okay, so what do we have next? Some people would say that this next system is a niche following. They would say that because you don't hear about it very often, that the game is dead. And that's kind of untrue. niche games or games that don't see a lot of face time, uh, it's not that they're dead. It's just that they're not D&D and they don't see the same video views that, and therefore are not going to get pushed by the algorithm that D&D does. Okay? Ubiquity is a game system that is based on dice pools, but does it in one of the most interesting ways and looking at it as a series of coin flips. Without going into the details about the system, it has the ability to take these large dice pools. Imagine playing a game, if you've never played it, like Shadowrun or any of these other dice pool games out there where you have to take these massive amounts of dice and you throw them on the table, and then you've got to figure out what's going on there with 30 d10s or 30 d6 or 30 d8s, whatever it might be, 30 d20s, who knows, maybe that one's out there. Ubiquity takes the dice pool system and crunches it into an easy way. Now, this really is reflected in the fact that in its early stages used specialty dice. And I know there is kind of a deep-seated hatred out there in the world of role-playing games for games that use specialty dice, but that's your problem, not the designer's problem. There was a reason for it, especially in part of Ubiquity's game design, and that it's one of the few games that it can explicitly point at something and say that it does a couple of things really well. One, it can play and emulate the, and I only agree with this so much because I think you can do this in other ways too. It can play pulp very well. And personally, for me, one of the things that it demonstrates more so than any other game system explicitly and implicit to its design is it shows character competence. The idea that you can take the average of your dice pool, and if that average would be a success, then your character does it. Now, other game systems would just say, hand wave. But there are very few game systems that will explicitly tell you in their design, this is how the game works. Maybe you want to do something like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and play Leagues of Adventure, right? Steampunk, Gothic, could be, Gothic. It does have some other aspects for its system. Regime Diabolique, where you play Musketeers with Supernatural. Great game, by the way. Overall, the system has turned to D6's dice pools, but that hasn't taken away from the simplicity of using the system and some of the aspects that you get from using the specialty dice. John Carter of Mars is another game, if I remember correctly, and Hollow Earth Expedition. So Hexy games and games that use Ubiquity, they really can't be considered dead just because a lot of people don't talk about them. They just don't see a lot of face time. The community, and especially the current developers of Ubiquity Triple Ace games, they do a lot. They put a lot of work into this. They also have a Call of Cthulhu game too. So definitely a system worth checking out. What happens though if we want to jump into something and say, well, I want something, there's always been this desire to find a generic role-playing game, generic meaning a system that I can use to play anything. One of my largest frustrations that I always have with D&D and the D20 system itself is that it had everything baked in to its core. Everything was level-based. Everything was class-based. There's just a lot of aspects and baggage that come with trying to adapt D20 to Star Wars, to pulp, Indiana Jones, in the Temple of Doom. Top Secret, was there a game? Gangbusters, 1920s bootleg era. Boot Hill, their Western. We had a lot of things that came along with it. So there are generic systems, BRP, developed from Call of Cthulhu, Mithras, RuneQuest, D100 based system. There are lots of generic D6 dice pool games out there. But what if you really want to jump and go into some very strange waters with a system that does things in a very, very different way than what you've done them before? a game system that really is easy to learn, no matter what people will tell you about the specialty dice involved. At its heart, this last game system was originally developed for Warhammer. It was the divisive sword stroke that split one of, like D&D, one of the most hardcore fan communities out there. When it came out, it was either to rave reviews that the game was designed revolutionarily, it was entirely something new, it was an actual innovation, to uh, like parenticide. You have killed my father. You have killed my brother. What have you done with my beloved sister? You have pillaged and plundered and debased. This is not even a role playing. This is a board game. It's got funny dice. It's got funny symbols. It's got too many cards. It's got too many pieces. It's too complicated. It's hard to learn. So at its core, what we're talking about is Genesis. Now, I still own and have played Warhammer 3rd Edition, and I found the game fun. I did not find the game hard to play. I took a while to learn to get it down because it was so new, and it did have a lot of pieces. It had cards and different things that would interact with the way you were playing. One of the most interesting aspects about the way the game was designed was the fact that you could just look at the table and see the condition of other players' characters. I didn't have to ask how another character was feeling, not the player, but the character. The dice talk a lot. They say so much compared to other games. The narrative dice system, as it's known, NDS, is different. The biggest complaint about was, well, I've got these funny dice. It takes too long. You know, I got to interpret these things. And yes, there are things you've got to do at the table. It's not a fast game. It's not a slow game. It's kind of like right in the middle. But let's face it, there's only 6 dice and 6 symbols. There's 26 letters in the English alphabet. And yet, so far, everything in this video, you've been able to understand with the words that I've been saying. It's far easier to learn how to play NDS than a lot of people think. I know. And I'll probably wind up doing a whole video about specialty dice. But yeah, it does require them. You can use different dice, but it's a bit of a pain. It's even more of a pain than actually just plunking down the money. Are they expensive? Sure. How many miniatures do you own? Do you paint miniatures? Do you use terrain? How much did that dice tower cost you? How much did you actually spend on your last full set of really wonky, funky, cosmic polyhedrals? I mean, DCC uses a ton of dice. In fact, dice that most games don't even play because of the way that game's designed. Generic, yes. But when we talk about familiarity, let's talk about Star Wars. Okay? This, in its development for narrative dice, was what really sent the game skyrocketing. When NDS came out with Edge of Empire, it shot through the roof, and more people are playing it. A lot of people still play. Now, because of, and let's face it, licensing, it's far easier to develop something for this for Fantasy Flight games than it really truly is to come in and do this. And that another fan community that can get divisive. But what if you want to play fantasy? Well, there's Realms of Tyrannod. So you've got that, a whole source book to learn that. Do you need the base core book? Sure, you do. The core book base, Genesis, really devotes a lot of time to help you understand what it takes to make and develop your own setting and to come up with stuff for using the narrative dice system. So there's world building involved. At its core, any generic system is going to require this unless you're going to buy the splat books or the hardcover core books. The core books that are going to help you make big jumps into fantasy or science fiction. So we've got Star Wars. What about cyberpunk? Now, this isn't the dystopian. This is a dystopian uh, cyberpunk like Android Shadow the Beanstalk, more developed from Android the card game. Fantastic game, by the way. It is a very different view on what happens when we look at cyberpunk. It's not Neuromancer. It's not Shadowrun. It's not Blade Runner. It's not going to be Cyberpunk Red or Cyberpunk 2020, but it has a lot of familiar aspects. The narrative dice system can do a lot. It talks a lot. It empowers everyone at the table to take a more active role in the emergent narrative that's going on. So if you're really looking to jump, it's definitely a deep pool to go into. But wait, there's more. Now, this is the last system, and it's probably the system I've played the least of, but it's also a system that I had grown to appreciate. It also has its share of problematic development, mostly due to layout design and text organization, but we're getting there. And that is 2D20. For me, Fallout was the game that really dragged me in. I tried Star Trek Adventures. I'm not a huge Trekkie fan, but I can appreciate the series. And it's a fascinating system to look at. It uses a pool of D20s. Like I said, there's a game out there for that that's going to use it. Maybe one day there'll be, 3D30 and 5D50. Who knows? But it also has its own share of mechanics that make it drastically different from other games. It shares some narrative DNA with NDS in that the system explicitly has rules to affect what's going on in the game. You could call them meta mechanics. Meta currency is involved. Meta currency is involved in the NDS system. Meta currency is involved in Ubiquity. And this is a concept that has kind of spread itself out across many different systems. So familiar, yet differently applied. Here, it's like a pendulum. And it's one of the things that can be divisive about this game. Everything else that we've talked about, for the most part, pardon me, has really not limited in many ways what the person who is running the game can do. 2D20 does. There is a pendulum between threat and momentum, or whatever the game system wants to call it, that only allows the players to do so much and only allows the GM to do so much. So it into of itself is a balancing mechanic of play at the table. For me, I struggled with really trying to get Star Trek off the ground. I gave those books to a friend of ours, and they have not decided to run it. So I'm waiting. Although I do also own the Dune books and Conan. Fallout, though, has been the game that I dove into the hardest. I am familiar with Conan, but wanted to get away from fantasy. And Fallout was familiarity stacked on top of familiarity. It's a complaint about Fallout that it really falls into and will fall out with the community, that it follows the video game a little too closely. The way the mechanics are structured and the way they're set up are just something that people feel cleaves too close. That they should have went a little further away with. Me, I'm fine with it. I'm pretty much fine with almost any game design. It's easy to do. Like any game that's an IP, it has loads of source material, but unlike many other IPs, it's not so tightly tied to one particular aspect. Conan the Barbarian is tied to sword and sorcery. Dune, the role-playing game, 2D20, is tied to Dune, the books. Kind of like the way Alien, for Free Leagues, is tied very tightly with Alien the movies. And the upcoming The Walking Dead game is going to be tied pretty closely to it. You can waffle a lot about IP games. They can feel restricting. They can be very open. It all depends on how you want to approach the pre-existing material. You dabble with Star Wars, you dabble with Star Trek, people can get pretty heated. But there's one genre that we haven't really talked about yet. And I'm going to add this one on as a bonus, just to end on one final note. When it comes to superheroes, there are quite a few games that immediately leap to people's minds. Marvel's Face Rip, probably the more divergent game that TSR came up with, a very beloved game, a game, again, tied with an IP that has well-known characters. They are very beloved. DC Comics didn't do so well with their RPG. It's a little too complicated. Mutants and Masterminds, Champions, Villains and Vigilantes. These games really stood the test of time. How can you do something different? So, Spectaculars. It's very simple, easy to pick up, very well organized. It uses a language familiar to anyone who's familiar with the comics industry is familiar with. It's vernacular of the retcon and the solo issue. Anything as far as a concept that you've seen done with characters editorially in the comics industry is really referenced here. The players are very much authors. The person who runs the game is the editor. You play issues. You have powers, but these powers, unlike many games, aren't loaded to the gills with stunts, feats, all kinds of stuff. They're very extremely simple. They're very stripped down, but the names and the descriptions they do have are very telling. There are certain mechanics that share aspects with other games. You can use certain stunts, which have cooldown and warm up. It's based on 2d10 percentile dice, also with advantage and disadvantage, d8s, black and white. It introduces a very interesting initiative system using a series of cards into which the stack of cards is commingled the villains, the mooks, or the henchmen, along with complications and hazards. And it changes every round, making it a very dynamic combat. You have a world book that you fill out, and you do that all together as a group, making for a very much a shared universe experience when it comes to developing your own comic line. Because that's what you really got to look at when you're playing this game, Spectaculars, is that you're a comic book company, and these are the heroes that you're writing the stories about. The pre-planned prep involved in the game is more like outlines. From Scratchpad Publishing, it uses its namesake. It uses a small, I believe it's like 5x8 scratch pad, the tear off. And on it, front and back of one of those sheets, is going to be the issue. Details that you will need to, as the editor, include while you're running the game. That leaves a lot of room for imagination. It leaves a lot of room for creativity. These are just the main things we need to make sure are going on. In between cutscenes, in between downtime, in between investigation, when the villains and the heroes actually do their thing. Two different aspects take place. You've got the scenes where the action is all going on, and then you have the scenes between the action. Some people just want to play the action, and you could very easily do that with Spectacular. Some people don't mind the aspect that comes in during Spectaculars during the downtime, because there is a particular mechanic that leverages that aspect of play. Easy to learn, easy to teach, and it covers a wide array of comic genre. Everything from the cosmic adventure in space, to the street level hero, to the epic superheroes we see today on the level of Superman, so on, that the game is worth picking up. And for me, after Face Rip, the TSR game, it's probably my go-to game when I want to play superheroes. If we're looking for something between other genres and we're looking for something that we just want to pick up and play, it literally is a game where I could sit down, we could tear off the sheets, and while I read the front and back of a 5x8 sheet, players can make their characters and we're up and running. So, given the rough waters we've been through, some people are out there on lifeboats. Some people are looking for new games to play. Some people are jumping ship. Some people are going to stick with what they want. It's all a matter of preference. But here's a collection of games that you can look through. Some suggestions on where you might turn to next. But just get out there and have fun. Play more games. And for crying out loud, continue to be good to each other.